Time to hook up the vote functionality. Here's the plan. These up and down vote icons are actually buttons. I'll show you. In show.html.twig, it's a button with name equals direction and value equals up. Thanks to the name and value attributes, if we wrapped this in a form and then clicked one of these buttons, the form would submit and send a post parameter called direction that's equal to either up or down based on which button was clicked. It's like having an extra input in your form. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Wrap this in a form, make it submit to a new endpoint, read the direction value, and increase or decrease the vote count. We could do this with an AJAX call instead of a form submit. From a Doctrine and Symfony perspective, it really makes no difference. So I'll keep it simple and leave JavaScript out of this. Let's start by creating that endpoint. In source/controller/question controller, because this is still related to questions, at the bottom, create a new method called question vote. Above, add the normal @route. For the URL, how about /questions/slug, that's equal to the show page above, then /vote. And because I know we'll need to generate a URL to this route for the form, give it a name. Name equals, how about app question vote. Finally, add methods equals post. This means that I can only make a post request to this endpoint. If we try to make a GET request, the route won't match. That's nice for two reasons. First, it's a best practice. If an endpoint changes data on the server, it should not allow GET requests. The second reason is really an example of why this best practice exists. If we allowed GET requests, then it would make it too easy to vote. Someone could post the voting URL somewhere, and unknowing users would vote just by clicking it. Worse, bots might follow that link and start voting themselves. Anyways, like before with the show page, we have a slug route wildcard that we need to use to query for the question object. Let's do that the same way. Add an argument with a question type in. And for now, just dd question. Time for the form. In show.html.twig, add a form element above the vote buttons and a closing form after them. Inside the form tag, we need a few things, like action equals set to curly path to generate a URL to the app question vote route. Set the slug wildcard to question.slug. The form tag also needs method equals post. Cool. With any luck, when we refresh the page, we should be able to click either button to submit to the endpoint. And yes, Symfony queried for the question object and we dumped it. This form doesn't look much like a traditional HTML form. It doesn't have any inputs or other real fields. But because it does have these two buttons and each has a name equals direction attribute, when we click a vote button, it will send a direction post field. Exactly like if we had typed the word up in a text box and submitted. So the question now is, how can we read post data from inside of Symfony? Well, whenever you need to read post data or query parameters or headers, what you're really doing is reading information from the request. And in Symfony, there is a request object that holds all of this data. To read post data, we need to get the request object. And because needing the request is so common, you can get it in a controller by using its type hint. Check this out. Add request, make sure to get the one from HTTP Foundation, and then request. This looks like service auto-wiring. It looks just like how we can type hint Entity Manager interface to get that service. But the truth is that the request is not a service in the container. What we're seeing here is one of the final cases of things that you can have as controller arguments. Let's review by listing all of the things that we're allowed to have as arguments to a controller. First, we can have an argument whose name matches one of the wildcards in the route. Second, we can auto-wire services with their type hint. Third, we can type hint an entity class to tell Symfony to automatically query for it. And finally, we can type hint the request class to get the request. Yep, this specific class has its own special case. There are a few other possible types of arguments that you can have in your controllers, but these are the main ones. Now that we have the request object, we're in luck. This is a simple class. It has a bunch of methods and properties to help us read anything from the request, like post parameters, headers, cookies, or the IP address. If we need to read some info from the request, it's usually a matter of just looking at the class or Googling Symfony request IP address to find the right method. Let's dump one part of the request, request arrow all. Yeah, I know, it looks a little funny. Request arrow request? Technically, post parameters are known as request parameters. So this request arrow request is a small object that holds all of the post parameters. The all method returns them as an array. So when we go over now and refresh, yes, we see direction equals up. Now we're dangerous. In the controller, add direction equals request arrow. Oh, and here you can see some other ways to get data. Like request arrow query is how you can get query parameters, and request arrow headers arrow get can be used to read a header. In this case, use request arrow get direction. Now, if direction equals up, then question arrow set votes, question arrow get votes plus 1. Else if direction equals down, do the same thing, but minus 1. If the direction is some other value, let's just ignore it. That probably means that someone is messing with our form and ignoring it is safe. At the bottom, DD question to see what it looks like. Okay, right now this question has 10 votes. When we refresh, yes, 11. Go back to the show page and hit down. 9. But this did not save to the database yet. It's just updating the value on our PHP object. And also, I think we can accomplish this +1 and -1 logic in a cleaner way. Next, let's talk about anemic versus rich models. Then we'll learn how to make an update query to update the vote count. Hint, we already know how to do this.